Gabby had a tattoo on her arm that read, "Let It Be," the title of a song from a band she loved. The beautiful thing about music is it can mean so many different things to so many different people. There's a verse from that song that speaks to me. When the broken-hearted people living in the world agree, there will be an answer. Let it be. It's okay to mourn for Gabby. It's okay to feel sorrow and pain. But we want to celebrate her and how she lived her life. We need to hold on to all those wonderful memories we shared with her, because that will be the answer. Let it be.
Right. Let it be.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to examine Gabby Petito's handwriting, and we are doing that because there's so little really on her to go on, besides from her social media. At the beginning of this video, you heard her stepfather, Jim Schmidt, talking about his daughter, his stepdaughter, as well as Joe. The entire eulogy from both Joe and Jim takes less than 10 minutes. I think it's 8 minutes, 29 seconds. And there's very little detail about Gabby in that. There's very little storytelling about, actual memories, actual information about her. And so for those people who are curious about her, we've got to go to things like her social media. And so in our efforts to get to know her, we're going to look at her handwriting to get a sense of the kind of person Gabby really was. And it is unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we don't get that personal, intimate portrait from the people closest to her. Instead, we're going to be examining Gabby's penmanship from 3 postcards, one from the Garden of the Gods, the next from the Red Canyon in Dixie National Forest, and a third was titled View from the Woods by, I think, the photographer Tyson Chappell. Before we get to it, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Welcome to the couple of thousand of you who have subscribed since the last video. And let's get started. So, Gabby's handwriting uses a combination of cursive and printed letters. Besides the relatively small size of her writing, indicative of introversion, the text in the sample slopes upward, showing optimism and excitement. Even so, some of the letters are tilted to the left, possibly indicating a reserved individual. There is an interesting variation in certain letter sizes, such as the first letter G in the Garden of the Gods postcard compared to the G in Gosh from a few words later, as well as the mixing of capital letters with small letters in her ordinary paragraphs. It's hard to say whether this combination of all caps and small caps has to do with literacy or something else, perhaps a need for emphasis, perhaps an emotional person, perhaps also a conflicted individual. But what is clear is how effusive Gabby is. Look at all those exclamation marks, about 17 in a sample of just 8 lines. For me, the standout idiosyncrasy is the letter I when Gabby is referring to herself. It's tiny. There is very little emphasis there, and significantly, while so many letters lean forward, that letter, referring to herself, leans back. Think also of the contrast between the effusiveness, the emphasis with all the exclamation marks, and then this really modest I. So you're already getting an interesting sense of a person that is intriguing, different, perhaps not that easy to understand. In the sample letter, the I is as short as typically shorter letters. So if you think about letters that don't have little hats on them or little tails or whatever poking into the air, you get shorter letters such as W, A, and S, as in was, as well as T in eating and the. You have this letter I. Remember, it's a capital letter, and it is as short as these other letters when it's supposed to be twice as tall. Now, you might think this tiny I in the Garden of the Gods postcard was exceptional, that it was a fluke, just one instance of it. But we see it repeated in the Red Canyon postcard as well, where Gabby writes, "And I miss you." The self-referencing I once again is the tiniest letter in the sentence. This may well indicate a modest personality, just as the writing itself is modestly proportioned. But the fact that this letter is so small possibly shows a low self-esteem or low confidence level. Now, that could be right, and if it is right, that could be one of perhaps a couple of reasons why, if you're looking at the question, why didn't Gabby just leave Brian? So self-esteem could have been an issue. It's also possible, if you ask, why was she with Brian in the first place, it's possibly a self-esteem issue as well. Where she writes, "More stars than I've ever seen. The I is uncharacteristically," and that is compared to the penmanship of many, many other people, almost the smallest letter of the three, right? She's talking about the more stars than I've ever seen. And there, once again, the I is a very small letter. The I is almost the same length as the V. Bear in mind, in a word like I've, right, the top part of the I, once again, should by rights tower over the V and the E, and it doesn't. Another letter to look out for is are small letters, such as B and D, because they also have those tails that are sort of above the rounded shapes that are below. And D's in particular have very short vertical tails. I'm talking about Gabby's D's, very short vertical tails, almost as short as the letters beside them. Have a look at the D in where she says, "That's wild." And then also take a look at the D in "and" from the Red Canyon postcard. In the second instance, it's almost a large, small letter A with a very small tail added. The length of vertical letters is often associated with ambition and or confidence. The fact that these letters, and occasionally also her letter I's, are crushed down, along with the self-referencing I, is no coincidence. The vowels are also known as communication letters. Gabby's rounded letters are mostly, if not all, closed, indicating once again a reserved or closed or introverted person. This is a less talkative person than average. Closed A's and O's also indicate discretion, someone capable of keeping a secret. What the handwriting seems to indicate is the anxiety that Gabby experiences irrespective of her basic optimism and idealism. So in other words, even if she was on this journey and she was enjoying this adventure and she was positive about it, there would nevertheless be basic anxiety present. The size inconsistency shows that there is some variation in this individual, perhaps in terms of moods and confidence. Gabby's relatively low cross T's also reflect a fairly modest sense of ambition. So if she was still alive, one would have encouraged her to aim higher, to have that horizontal bar on the T go slightly higher. The relatively big open spaces to the right of her sentences, and that's a reference to the right margin, and that is evident in all three postcards. That potentially shows someone who is preoccupied or to some extent stuck in the past, perhaps thinking about her childhood, her family, growing up, things like that. Now, if we go to psychologistworld.com, they have some analysis on what this right-hand margin aspect deals with. And this is a quote from there. They say, quote, "The right margin indicates the writer's attitude to the future." And obviously, that is something that was very important during the summer epic between July and August. What was Gabby's attitude to the future? What was Brian's attitude? How was their attitude to the future different? it goes on to say, a narrow right margin shows a person's willingness to embrace the future and new ideas. They will tend to be more open and possibly progressive in their attitudes, adjusting easily to new situations and keen to socialize with other people. So in this respect, it would be interesting to see Brian's handwriting and to see how it differs from Gabby's. Is it bigger? Is the same thing with the right-hand margin and so on? If the margin on the right of the page is wide, it shows a person's caution towards the future. And in these samples, certainly, Gabby does demonstrate a wide margin. She is cautious about the future. And this could also, going back to psychologistworld.com, they say someone who is cautious about the future that has this wide margin perhaps prefers the stability of the status quo and the traditions that they have adjusted to. And I think what that basically may point towards is that Gabby may have, whatever that was argued about, whatever was a difference of opinion between the two, she may have preferred the stability of the status quo in terms of wanting to be engaged, liking the fact that she's in something that is stable and permanent rather than temporary and kind of unstable, right? Now, as for the relatively large spaces between letters, which I think is known as kerning, I don't think it shows an excessively OCD person or excessive perfectionism for that matter. If the letters were more regimented and neater and closer together, one would imagine a really above average need for control. And I would imagine that Brian's letters might look a little bit like that. Gabby's penmanship in this regard seems to show a fairly relaxed personality. Now, the spacing between words as opposed to letters shows our attitude to relationships. Narrow spacing between words, according to an article on penmanship in goodhousekeeping.com, and I'll put links to both those articles in the description, that can be indicative of a fear of abandonment, right? Large spaces between letters can reveal difficulties connecting with others. In the Red Canyon postcard, there are some relatively large spaces between words, especially in the 4th and 5th lines. But it's also evident in the last few lines of the Garden of the Gods postcard. In her signatures, Gabby's name is elevated, showing optimism, but both the vertical tails of both bees are so short as to be almost absent. Finally, the letter Y and other letters with looping tails, such as the lowercase letter G and J, are associated with relationships to money as well as action. A big loop also suggests creativity and even fantasy. We see variation here too, with a biggish loop in Hey Nick, that's in the Red Canyon postcard, but then no loop whatsoever in the Y in Everywhere or the Y in Every Night, a few lines later. In the Garden of the Gods postcard, all 3 G's, referring to eating, have generous loop tails, but both Y's in Everyone's and Gabby near the end don't have any. It may be that these inconsistencies show someone having difficulty in the area of creativity and money. I think one's also got to acknowledge that with a youngish person, there may be still some room for growing. They're still finding themselves and finding their way. And so that may be reflected to some extent in their handwriting. Handwriting analysis is very subjective. You can have 2 handwriting experts looking at it in a totally different way, and we see that in the John Benet Ramsey ransom note, where there were different interpretations. Some people almost being absolutely sure to exclude Patsy Ramsey as the author, and others being quite certain. And there were various methods to anchor the text, including the content of the text, to Patsy Ramsey. So I certainly do see a lot of value in getting to know a person through their handwriting. If you found this video interesting, you might find the next one also dealing with getting to know Gabby worth listening to. That'll be about Gabby's Twitter profile, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.